Bitcoin has recently set new all-time highs, yet BTC Treasury companies are currently down considerably. Are we likely to see a sustained recovery in these company share prices, or could their outperformance be gone for good? So we'll get right into it. The top public Bitcoin treasury companies data we have here on BitcoinMagazinePro.com. Now, these aren't necessarily treasury companies, but I just thought I'd outline that over $100 billion, over 931,000 Bitcoin is held by these 76 public companies holding at least 100 BTC, which is pretty crazy to think about. That's a massive amount of accumulation in a relatively short space of time. If we look at the active Bitcoin treasuries, these are the companies that are actually trying to accumulate as much as they can. It's their, well, maybe not their entire aim and a goal of accomplishment, but it's certainly one of their top priorities. We can see of these 22 companies, there's 717,000 Bitcoin being held, with, of course, a vast majority of this being held by Strategy or MicroStrategy, MSTR. All we can see, if we just go over to the MSTR data here, we can see that over the past few weeks, it's been down a fair bit. It's a pretty disappointing $363 as I film this. Of course, it's going to be different as you watch this. But as Bitcoin has been setting new highs above $124,000, I know we've had a slight retracement, but it's disappointing to see that we're not even relatively close to new highs when looking at Strategy or even many of these Bitcoin accumulation companies. What we can see is, of course, their performance has been good, but what I've done here is just isolate their Strategy holdings, the Bitcoin holdings of Strategy just throughout 2025. Now, I think a big reason as to why we've actually seen a little bit of underperformance when looking at Strategy, and I know other Bitcoin companies are different. They've been very aggressively accumulating, but Strategy in particular, over the past few months, it seems like their accumulation has slowed down somewhat. I know they did have that big purchase in July, but we can see it's almost looking like it's tailing off. It was rising incredibly fast, and now we're kind of flatlining a little bit, which could be one reason that we've seen a little bit of underperformance in these stocks, potentially slowing down their accumulation. What we can also see is, if we just go over here to this tab, is that it may also be a fact of dilution in terms of products being offered. So this is MSTR specific. We'll look at other examples later, but it's not just MicroStrategy anymore. Now you can buy Stride or Strike or Strike or Strife. A lot of things beginning with S there. I feel like they could be a little bit more creative with the names. All STR as well, I've just realized that. But if we just go back to this chart here, what we can see is the net asset value premium for Strategy has been dropping considerably. Now, this has been a trend throughout quite a lot of these treasury companies. And I think one of the main reasons that we're actually seeing this underperformance is that historically over the past few years and months, especially when looking at the first movers, Strategy, the Meta Planets, these first companies that were really aggressively accumulating Bitcoin, I feel like their edge has maybe diminished somewhat. When it was just Strategy, how else were you necessarily going to gain exposure to a leveraged Bitcoin play, a company actively, aggressively accumulating Bitcoin by leveraging debt to their advantage, and of course diluting shares with at-the-money offerings? But now there's 22, and it seems like every week there's a new one. And this is just active Bitcoin treasury companies, but if you look at just the public companies holding Bitcoin, not even necessarily actively, aggressively accumulating, you're pretty much spoiled for choice now. Now, alongside the ETFs as well, I do feel like the general trend for not just Strategy, but for all of these Bitcoin treasury companies, for their premium to Bitcoin and net asset value, the net asset value premium is generally going to trend towards 1. Now, of course, there's going to be boom bust cycles, there's going to be periods of outperformance or underperformance, but especially for these companies that aren't necessarily offering anything outside of Bitcoin accumulation, it makes sense that this premium would eventually trend towards 1 until there could be new offerings, new products, new derivatives. Now, even if you look at Stride, Strike, Stretch, or Strife, even they are down. They're not at new all-time highs. They're not even really that close to new all-time highs, apart from Stretch, which was launched very recently. But I think with Strategy specifically, I think one of the reasons, especially of the past few days, that we've seen a little bit of an underwhelming performance is if you look to their Q2 earnings call. Now, this image in particular was kind of focusing on the fact that Strategy were going to aim to dilute their shares a little bit less aggressively. What we have seen over the past few months is the number of Strategy shares in circulation, that free float, has been rapidly increasing. Now, this is so they can buy more Bitcoin. This is so that they can sell stocks and just accumulate more Bitcoin more aggressively. But this obviously isn't great for the share price to constantly dilute your current shares. But what we can see is that they had recently announced, specifically this one here, below 2.5 multiple of the net asset value premium, Strategy will not issue MSTR except to pay interest on debt obligations and to fund preferred equity dividends. Now, this all sounds great. Now they're not going to be dumping more at the money shares to just fund more Bitcoin accumulation. But what we can see is Saylor then kind of backtracked a couple of weeks later on this to add in the third clause of when otherwise deemed advantageous to the company, which if you're an MSTR holder like I am, and which I'm sure a lot of you are, isn't ideal to hear this kind of opaque reasoning and technical choices behind diluting their current shares. If we just go over to TradingView here, which if I press this button will come up, what we can see is I've showed the wrong chart. We can see, looking at this chart here, which is the, if I just click on it here, the diluted outstanding shares for Strategy, we can see when they began their Bitcoin accumulation in August of 2020, they had an outstanding diluted shares of around 96, 97 million. Now, over the past few years, this has increased to over 300 million. So if we just look to the Strategy chart here, we can see, if I just grab from the all-time high that we set in last year when Bitcoin's price was considerably lower than it is today, we're currently down around 33%. Now, this is primarily due, unfortunately, to this dilution. If I look at the market cap chart of Strategy as opposed to the price chart, we can see that we'd have actually set new all-time highs in July of this year, just around a month ago. And we'd only be down from the all-time highs, if I just grab around here, by around 18, 19, less than 20% as I film this. So that additional 13+% is just all driven by dilution, because the market cap is reflecting this, because it is the circulating supply of these shares multiplied by the price. So we can actually see in the market cap the underlying valuation of the business itself. But because these shares are constantly being diluted, it's leading to a chart that looks like this for a lot of these companies, where this is just over the past month or so since the start of July. We can see that all but one of them, Marathon, which has been up by about 2%, have been actually in the red. They've been negative returns. If we just show Bitcoin as a baseline here in the white line, we can see that Bitcoin has outperformed all of these quite considerably. This is Strategy and then the top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 other Bitcoin accumulation companies. Now, one thing I like to do when trying to do this type of analysis to whether I should be allocating more to Strategy or be looking at other Bitcoin companies is, rather than just look at the USD valuations, if I actually look at the chart versus something else. So here I'm actually measuring Bitcoin measured in shares of Strategy. Now, what I can do is, if I just draw something on around here, we can see that this is going back to 2017. So as Bitcoin topped up here in 2017, the chart looks fairly similar to the USD chart. But since Strategy started aggressively accumulating Bitcoin in August of 2020, we can see Bitcoin didn't really set new all-time highs. It briefly set new highs in the double top, well, the first peak of that cycle in 2022. Oh, that was the second peak, actually. We can see that Bitcoin did set new highs there. But we can see since then in this cycle, even though Bitcoin has rallied from $15,000 to over $120,000, it has not even been close to making a new high versus Strategy, because of MicroStrategy's outperformance. It's been accelerating to the upside faster than Bitcoin has. However, what we can see is this line that I drew on is actually showing a pretty key level of support for Strategy. We can see, well, for this ratio, we can see that as Bitcoin bottomed out in this bear market of 2018, it's pretty much exactly where this ratio bottomed out in this cycle so far. So we can see we actually came down here in November last year as Strategy was making that high. We actually came back and went beneath this before very quickly coming back above this level of support resistance. So we can see that ever since then, we've actually come back down and retested this. And Strategy hasn't been able to make a new high versus Bitcoin since that day in 2024. Now we can see if Bitcoin is, well, if Strategy is to break beneath this support on Bitcoin and do something like this, then even if Bitcoin is running to 140, 150, 200 plus $1,000, this would indicate that Strategy is outperforming. But the way you need to look at this is just, again, looking into probabilities. What's the probability of Strategy continuing to outperform when looking at a chart like this? So when I look at this, I can see that this has also been a pretty key influential level on this price chart. We can see tested multiple times here, and again, most recently over here. It wouldn't surprise me to see this chart move to the upside and test this level of support, resistance, whatever you want to call it, depends which asset you're really looking into, and see if we can either break above, maybe set this as a new level of support resistance and come back down, or if we come back and then from here. So I think right now we're kind of in this choppy consolidationary zone in this ratio. We can see somewhere between 250 and 370 MSTR shares per Bitcoin. So it would be interesting to see over the coming weeks how we can react following that. But like I said, I think the overwhelming trend for a lot of these treasury companies, if I just go back here, is we are going to see more and more of these companies trend towards an asset value premium ratio of 1. Unless we can see these big mania phases, unless we see strategy added into the S&P 500 and we see a huge amount of capital inflows just going in to balance that index. What we can see is if we just go to this here, this was kind of just the transcript of their Q2 earnings call. We can see that strategy actually have somewhat expectation, I'll call it, of a BTC price by the end of the year of $150,000. Now what I can do is if I just go over to this chart here, this is almost a MSTR fair valuation or speculation pricing method. So what we can do is just plugged in $150,000. This is the outstanding diluted shares that we saw. We can see the net asset value premium there, the current amount of Bitcoin that they own and the current price. So we can see right now they have a fair valuation based purely on their Bitcoin holdings. And again, this is ignoring any derivative products, any convertible bonds that again may issue more Bitcoin, or any stock buybacks if we had to see this net asset value dip beneath 1, excluding all of that, company earnings, whatever. Then the actual fair valuation of MSTR currently is around $307, which of course is a little bit lower today, but not substantially. We're actually fairly close to this level. However, what we can see, in fact, that's $100,000. Ignore that. If I put $115,000 in, Bitcoin's current price, then the fair valuation of MSTR is about $236. But at 150K, we'd still see a fair valuation of $307. But this is assuming no more accumulation. If we see continued accumulation, even though it has tapered off somewhat over the coming months, then we could see strategy holding somewhere between 650 to 750,000 Bitcoin. Now, I can't foresee us considerably sustaining levels above 2.5x on strategy in terms of their net asset value premium, just given the fact that they have been more vocal in the fact that at this point they will opportunistically issue further MSTR to dilute their share price to acquire more Bitcoin. So we'll assume somewhere between a 2x and a 2.5x on this premium is a realistic possibility, I guess, if we had to see a big mania phase blow off top. So if we had to see MSTR holding between 650 and 750,000 and an asset value premium of between 2 and 2.5x, then it gives us a share price of around $630 to around $900. But we also need to acknowledge that to get to this point, we're probably, again, looking back to here, going to see more MSTR shares enter circulation. So if we assume 10% more MSTR shares, roughly to around 336 million outstanding shares, then what we can see is we're getting somewhere to around $580 to maybe $830 as a potential target for MSTR. Now, if I just go back to this chart, I know I've talked a lot this video, but if we just go back to this one, which is just the pure MSTR price, what we can do is if I go onto a logarithmic chart here and just hide this, it's a pretty interesting way to actually gain targets above price action that we've never seen before, to use Fibonacci extensions. It's something I like to do. So what you can do is just grab this Fibonacci extension tool, grab it from the lows of the previous cycle to the highs. And what we can see, if I just zoom right in, the local peak that we had, well, I say local peak, the all-time high that we've currently set aligns perfectly with this Fibonacci extension point within just a few cents of that. And we can see these levels have been pretty influential for the MSTR price action beyond prices that we'd ever seen previously. So it does give us some indication that these levels are something that people, traders, investors are watching. And if we just scroll above our current all-time high on this Fibonacci extension, the next point is about $800, which if I just go back to here, is kind of somewhere in this region. If strategy can accumulate somewhere between 700, 750,000, especially if they could accumulate 800,000 Bitcoin by the year end, which at this point might be a tall order, but it's somewhere between a 2 and a 2.5x net asset value premium. That comes to exactly $800. So I think this is kind of where I'm maybe anticipating a speculative peak for MSTR. That's more my bull case. I guess more of a bear case would be just a retest of the current all-time high. But are Treasury companies dead? No. We are going to continue to see periods of overperformance and underperformance. We are going to see the volatility diminish over time as the net asset value premium trends towards 1. And as I said, I think this is mainly just due to the dilution of shares that these companies are obligated almost to facilitate their Bitcoin accumulation. And as well as that, just the fact that there are more and more Treasury companies every single week that we're seeing popping up, which is a good thing for the space. I say this is a negative thing. It's not the most positive thing if you are an owner of these company shares. But if you're just looking at Bitcoin, this is 718 roughly thousand Bitcoin that might never see the open market again. If we go back to this one, it's not going to be long before we see over 1 million Bitcoin held by these Bitcoin public companies. And at that point, this is going to be well over $100 billion. A huge percent of the circulating supply. This is the 21 million. If we just look at the circulating supply, which is about 19.8 million, then this is a huge percentage of all Bitcoin that will ever exist and currently in circulation that might never see the open market. This is incredibly bullish for the share price of these companies by just looking at Bitcoin. If we just go back to this one, I know I've been rambling a lot, but if we assume a price of 200,000 BTC for this cycle, if we are to see a bit of a lengthening cycle, and just where we were looking at before, then again, it suddenly raises the price targets to over $1,000 as a fairly reasonable expectation for what MSTR can do. And again, if they are issuing more derivative products, more strides, more strikes, more stretches, more stripes, all of this to accumulate more and more Bitcoin, then we may be undershooting how much Bitcoin MSTR can accumulate. And like I said, if we are seeing lengthening cycles, then maybe we're not looking between 600 and 750,000 Bitcoin. Maybe we're looking between 8 and 900,000. And maybe Saylor goes back on this previous statement of otherwise deemed advantageous dilution of shares, and we go back to what they initially said a few weeks ago, in which they wouldn't issue new MSTR beneath a 2.5x. Then who knows? I still think the asymmetric opportunity of these companies for this cycle remains incredibly high, but realistically, I wouldn't over-allocate to them, especially considering where Bitcoin looks towards on those ratio charts. That potentially points towards a period of outperformance, more outperformance from Bitcoin over the coming weeks. Also, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to ensure you're receiving all of our content as soon as it's released. And make sure to check out all the resources we discussed today, as well as the morning note that are all available on BitcoinMagazinePro.com, your number one source for Bitcoin analysis. So just to summarize, BTC Treasury companies like Strategy or MSTR have recently had a pretty torrid time, and when comparing them to Bitcoin have significantly underperformed in recent weeks. However, there are a number of the reasons that actually make sense for this period of drawdown, but the main and most obvious one is of course the share dilution by these companies, which is pretty much required to actually fund their additional accumulation of Bitcoin. But if you do look at the market cap of these companies, you can actually see that opposed to the individual share price, that you can really see the impact of these, and the actual valuation of the companies themselves isn't necessarily down that much. They're actually performing fairly well and have recently set new all-time highs like Bitcoin in many instances. Although I do feel that the net asset value of these companies will probably trend towards 1 eventually, I do still think there'll be periods of over or underperformance just based on human psychology. In every market, we always have boom and bust cycles, and especially with MSTR potentially being included in the S&P 500 and players like Metaplanet kind of cornering the industry within certain markets, then of course there is going to be a premium that people will pay. But eventually, especially as more and more of these treasury companies come into existence, I can see them kind of trending towards this net asset value premium, at least hovering around a value of 1. If you like this video, then please visit BitcoinMagazinePro.com, where our analytics help you to cut through the noise to make informed, data-driven decisions about Bitcoin. With over 150 live charts, personalized indicator alerts, in-depth crypto industry reports, API access, and more, all for a fraction of the standard industry price. And let me know what your thoughts are on Bitcoin treasury companies. Do you think that they potentially have seen their day of massive speculative overperformance, or do you think that this is just a little bit of a pullback before we see them massively rocket to the upside again and really provide almost a leverage beta outperformance of Bitcoin? As I said, let me know in the comments below, and on social media I look forward to reading and replying to them. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.